Thank you guys for tuning in today and welcome to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, San Raza. Today I will be talking to Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and the Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. Oliver Stone, Hollywood film director, also co-authored a documentary film series and book with Peter called The Untold History of the United States. Peter, glad to have you on today.
Good to see you again, Zane.
Let us begin with the situation in Iran. We saw sharp escalation recently between Iran and the U.S. Week-longs of protests and violence in Iraq, the assassination of General Soleimani, and now Iran responding by firing missiles at the U.S. base that used to house U.S. troops. There were no reported casualties. Iran also declared it would no longer abide by any of the restrictions imposed by the nuclear deal, including its limitations on the enrichment of the uranium, while the UN and the US announced it would further tighten economic sanctions. Could you provide your assessment of this situation and talk about its significance?
Well, we've been fearing that Donald Trump would do something reckless when it came to foreign policy and military policy. We've been fearing that since he first got elected. And we were surprised that he hadn't done anything as rash and extreme as some of the things we saw under Bush and Obama. But we knew that given his mentality, that he was capable of doing something extremely dangerous. And what he's done now is push the United States to the brink of war with Iran. This was totally a crisis of America's own making. When Trump took office, the nuclear deal was in effect, which meant that Iran was not going to be on a path toward developing nuclear weapons for at least 15 years, and really much longer than that. And Trump, the thing about this Trump administration is that it had a lot of extremists when it came to foreign policy. But the one thing that they all agreed on was their hatred of Iran. In fact, they wanted to get the Korean crisis out of the way, I believe, so they could focus on Iran. This is not anything new in terms of American foreign policy. The hatred of Iran goes back many years. And during the Bush administration, there were people who were pushing for U.S. attack on Iran, and during that time. Obama walked that back a little bit. But the people in the Trump administration were very aggressive toward Iran. In fact, Mattis, who was often considered the adult in the room, who was trying to restrain Trump, he had been demoted and basically pressured out by Obama because he was so extreme on Iran, and he was the least extreme in the Trump administration. So now that with the killing of Soleimani, he consulted with the people who pushed him to do this were Pompeo, Pence, we think Giuliani especially, were the three who were pushing him to take these actions. Pompeo is supported by Esper, the Secretary of Defense. Pompeo has said that Trump was God's gift to humanity to protect Israel against Iran. And so what we see now is no restraints. The advisors have little knowledge of the area, little knowledge of foreign policy. There is no permanent director of national intelligence in the U.S. There's no deputy director of national intelligence. There's no permanent director of Homeland Security, no deputy director of Homeland Security. You go down the line, no secretary of the Navy. So we're in a situation where you've got the blind leading the blind. Trump, who knows nothing about anything really, is taking the direction from people who know very little more than he does. So it makes for a very dangerous situation. An escalation, you look at the results of this attack, so Iran is pulling out of the nuclear deal completely. They at least held some limitations before that. In Iraq, there have been protests against Iranian influence in Iraq. That has stopped. Now the Iraqi parliament has demanded the United States leave. the Iraqi prime minister demanded the United States leave. Trump is threatening Iraq with severe sanctions of a sort they've never seen before if they throw the United States out, but that is about to happen. The other consequence in Iran. There were recently demonstrations in Iran against the government there. Now the entire Iranian nation is unified in opposition. The chant is no longer criticism of Khamenei and the Iranian government. It's death to America. Then on top of that, we've got the Europeans. The United States did not consult our European allies beforehand, even though many of them have been involved in training the Iraqis to fight ISIS. So they're furious with the United States again, and they were already furious with the United States for pulling out of the JCPOA and nuclear deal. The winner in this situation is ISIS now, because we've suspended our campaign against ISIS, and also Iran, because Khamenei and Rouhani are the ones who look like statesmen at the time that Trump looks like a very dangerous a lunatic. And people who support him, the things that they've been saying. I mean, we've got this constant refrain that Soleimani, that it was great that we killed Soleimani because he had blood on his hands. First of all, he was in Baghdad at the invitation of the Iraqi prime minister because they were trying to work out a deal to ease tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That would have been a good thing for everybody. And then this idea that he's got all this American blood on his hand. Well, yes, he does. But why is that? It's because the United States illegally invaded Iraq in 2003. And he was assisting the resistance to the U.S. occupation of Iraq. So the real person who's got blood on his hands is George Bush. And then Barack Obama, not as much as Bush, not as much as Bush. It's to say that Soleimani has blood on his hand is really to misread the situation.
I would like to take a step even further and also examine media coverage side by side. When Iran launched missiles at US housing bases, many media outlets in Germany reported that this was the first time that Iran attacked the US since 1979. However, when the US assassinated General Soleimani, there was rarely any historical context brought into play. For example, what was underreported is the CIA-led overthrow of the democratically elected government of 1943 in Iran, or how the US has historically encircled Iran with military bases. Another fact that I noticed went unreported is that there was a lot of debate taking place whether in German media, whether the United States and Germany should stay in Iraq given their fight against ISIS, but little to no mention is made of the elaborate role that you touched upon, which Iran played also against the fight against ISIS. So the next question will be twofold. Number one, how do you assess the media coverage in the United States? And number two, can you also provide us some long-term historical perspective starting from the post-World War II period?
The American media is expressing the same kind of ignorance and lack of historical context that it always provides. To the extent there's been any looking back, people say that we've been at war with Iran since 1979. Well, maybe, there's a reason why the Iranians hated the United States in 1979. In early 1950s, the Iranian parliament, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mossadegh, decided to nationalize Iran's oil industry. Why were they doing that? Because the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was paying Iran 16 cents on the dollar for the oil that it was taking out of Iran. The British were getting 84 cents on the dollar. The Iranians got very upset when Aramco carried out a deal with Saudi Arabia, in which the Saudis were getting 50 cents on the dollar. So Mossadegh, who had been involved for a long time, you have to remember that Mossadegh was actually at Versailles in 1919 trying to get independence for Iran from British Empire way back then. So he was a nationalist from way back. And he was also enormously popular. People forget that he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1951. So Mossadegh was the first Iranian to ever get a Doctor of Laws degree from a European university. He was beloved in Iran. In fact, when the crisis erupted, the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad, in Tehran, wrote back to the State Department that Mossadegh had the support of between 95 and 98% of the Iranian people. So this was an enormously popular figure, as was Soleimani. And I would say that in Mossadegh's case, even more deservedly so. And so the British want to overthrow Mossadegh. At that point, Iran was producing 40% of the world's oil. So it was a very, very important player in terms of oil production. British wanted to overthrow Mossadegh. Truman hesitated to allow that operation to continue. But as soon as Eisenhower took office, Eisenhower decided to go ahead and run the coup. It was greatly influenced by John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director. So they began to plot a coup. They brought in Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt was the CIA person in charge of all operations in the Middle East. Archie Roosevelt was also involved, as was Miles Copeland, who was another top CIA station chief in the region. And they ran this coup. First, they destabilized the Iranian economy. Then they brought up politicians, they brought up journalists, they brought up this armed gang of Islamic fanatics and unleashed them all. They overthrew the Mossadegh government. And not only did they overthrow Mossadegh, they brought in the Shah of Iran to run things there. The Shah implemented a dictatorship for the next 26 years, including vast amounts of torture. They created SAVAK, the Iranian intelligence operation that was terrorizing the Iranian people for the next 26 years. So yes, in 1979, they do overthrow the government of the Shah. They do. Then when the United States allows the Shah in, supposedly for medical treatment, as was being pushed at the time by Kissinger and David Rockefeller especially, then the Iranians are so furious they take over the U.S. embassy and hold the 52 Americans hostage for a period of time. So the background is that the United States overthrew a democratically elected, insanely popular government in Iran in 1953, the CIA's first successful example of overtly running a coup. They do it the next year in Guatemala also. But this is the first time. And of course, the Iranian people hated the United States. How would the Americans have felt if we had a popular president with 95 to 98% support and the Iranians ran a coup and overthrew him and imposed a dictatorship? Of course they hated the Americans, but the American media does not provide that kind of context. It doesn't get mentioned at all in mainstream American media.
Unfortunately, we had the same situation in German media. But getting back to the recent situation, you've already touched upon some of the arguments, but for the sake of objectivity, I will continue to provide the arguments of the White House. So the White House, as well as the German government, have taken the stance that they just reacted to the Iranian provocations. The assassination of General Soleimani was a reaction to Iranian provocations. To name a few things that they said, Soleimani was posing an imminent threat to the United States, was responsible for hundreds of U.S. soldiers, for violent protests, especially against the U.S. embassy in Iraq, including the death of a U.S. contractor. And all of this was done in an act of self-defense. Today I read that they even cited the UN Charter for citing self-defense. Can you address the validity of these arguments?
Well, there seems to be no basis for these arguments. The top officials in the Pentagon, State Department, briefed both houses of Congress yesterday. And the Congress people said they provided no evidence at all that was convincing to support. Even some of Trump's staunchest defenders said that this was the worst briefing, the most insulting, demeaning briefing to Congress that has been given in years and years and years. Even Republicans came out afterwards and said this was an insult, that they provided no evidence. And the Trump administration is saying, well, we can't provide evidence because it's classified and secret. Well, these people had security clearances. They could hear the evidence, but there was no imminent threat. I mean, there's always plotting going on. The Americans are always making plans for attacks or actions there. The Iranians are always making plans. This was nothing imminent, and it was a foreign policy disaster. USA Today just came out with a poll. 55% of Americans now say that the United States is less safe as a result of this assassination of Soleimani. 24% say the United States is more safe. 21% say they don't know. So 55% less safe, 24% more safe. This whole thing is backfiring. The only one who supports it overtly right now is Netanyahu. And the Netanyahu and the Yahoos in the Republican Party, elected officials. But aside from the Yahoos in Israel and in the United States, the American people are very upset about this. American people did not support this. I went on Iranian national television the other day and made clear that if Iran reacts the way Trump has baited them into reacting, then it will give Trump what he wants, and that's a pretext to go to war with Iran. That Iran has got to be smart. It's not hard to be smarter than Trump, because everybody's smarter than Trump, but they've got to be smarter than American foreign policy. And so far they have been. They deliberately de-escalated. They deliberately avoided inflicting casualties on American and Iraqi troops. But they can't control, especially with Soleimani out, they do not have complete control over Hezbollah, over the militias in Iraq, over forces in Syria. I'm afraid that something else is going to happen to give Trump the excuse he wants. He saw what happened with Thatcher. In fact, in 2011 and 2012, Trump accused Obama of trying to provoke a war with Iran so that Obama could use that to get himself reelected in 2012. And Trump has got a little brain. And so he knows a few plays, and one of the plays is this one that he thinks he can pull off. Well, it's going to backfire, but not just that. The cost that it's going to have in terms of human life. My friend Larry Wilkerson, Colonel Wilkerson, who is Colin Powell's chief of staff and a brilliant military mind, says that a war with Iran would be 10 to 15 times as costly for the United States as was the invasion of Iraq in terms of financial cost as well as in terms of human casualties. That's a human beings, what we have to do is avoid anything that's going to lead to more loss of life. The Americans are already making the Iranians suffer enough with sanctions, and now Trump says he's going to double down on the sanctions and impose more. What he can do to hurt the Iranian people more, we don't know.
Not to mention the cost that Europe will pay, the refugee crisis of 2015, where 1 million people came desperately across borders. This will be, I think...
If the Europeans had any integrity whatsoever, they would impose sanctions on the United States right now. They would bring Trump up before in The Hague. The hypocrisy of imposing sanctions on other countries, but not imposing sanctions on the United States when the United States acts as the world's rogue power, and the Europeans know this. And they don't have the integrity or the guts to stand up to the United States.
So let's get to the last question. Let's leave this interview with a positive note. You've done a big deal of research on anti-war movements. You were part of the anti-nuclear movement yourself. Talk about what our viewers could take home from this interview to make sure that we do not go into another war.
The sad thing is that we don't have a lot of ability to prevent another war. That Trump has the authority and the power to act unilaterally to start a war. What's needed right now is for the Europeans to get together with Russia and China in order and to demand a global summit in order to not only ease tensions between the United States and Iran, but to impose some kind of statesmanship on the world right now. There are no statesmen who are saying that we are in a dangerous and even insane situation, and that humanity demands that we walk this back right now. And I'd love to see Merkel and Macron and Xi and Putin start to act as if the world's responsibility for world peace is in their hands, and that the United States has a rogue president who is under impeachment right now and is up for re-election again later this year, and that this is a temporary state of affairs and it's possible to impose certain sanity again. But we need an anti-war movement in Europe. When 3 million people showed up on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, 3 million showed up in Rome alone, 1 million in London. We need that kind of outpouring. The Germans, the French, and others took leadership in denouncing what the United States was planning to do. We need that in the United States, and we need that everywhere, because we know that leaders listen to that, and that they could help us get rid of Trump. And they should be speaking outwardly and saying that that Trump is a menace on the world scene. Not do it like the Russians did with bots and this and that kind of thing in 2016. Say openly that the world cannot abide by and tolerate 4 more years of this madman in the White House.
Peter Kuznick, thank you so much for your time today.
You say.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the bell below, and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. I'm your host, Zan Raza. See you guys next time.